Every fallen monarchy is supposed to end the same way. A king loses his crown, his country moves on, and a few generations later his descendants show up at royal weddings as minor celebrities with impressive last names and no real claim on anything. That's the story we're used to. It's tidy, it's over. It is rarely how it actually works. Somewhere in Washington right now, a 65-year-old man who has never ruled a country is treated by parts of the world's press, by members of the European Parliament, by American lawmakers, as a serious answer to the question of who comes next in Iran. He calls himself a crown prince. He has no crown. The country he claims hasn't had a monarchy in almost half a century. And yet, in the spring of 2026, he stood in the Swedish parliament. He has taken the stage at a major American political conference to a standing ovation. As recently as this month, his face has shown up on protest signs outside a World Cup match, held by people who were not alive when his family ruled anything. Think about that for a second. A throne can be abolished by revolution, formally and permanently, with no legal path back, and its heir can still be doing television interviews from exile 46 years later, treated as relevant to decisions being made about his country's future today. That's Reza Pahlavi, son of the last Shah of Iran, a king who was never crowned, still waiting. To understand how a family goes from absolute rulers of an empire to permanent exiles who nonetheless never quite leave the stage, you have to go back to the beginning of the end. Not to a date on a calendar, to a system of power so total, so certain of itself, that almost nobody inside it saw the collapse coming until it was already happening. Start with one number. By the late 1970s, Iran's oil revenue ran into the tens of billions of dollars a year, and almost all of it answered to one man. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had ruled Iran for close to 4 decades by then. He held the title Shahanshah, King of Kings, and by 1967 had added a second title to underline the point, Arya Meher, Light of the Aryans. He meant both of them literally. Oil money had transformed Tehran. Iran had one of the largest militaries in the region, built on billions of dollars in American weapons purchases, fighter jets, tanks, an arsenal that made Iran, on paper, the strongest military power in the Persian Gulf. The Shah had launched what he called the White Revolution in the early 1960s, land reform that broke up large estates, dam and irrigation projects, a national literacy campaign, industrial expansion funded almost entirely by oil, personal incomes climbed, cities grew. On the numbers the Shah liked to quote, Iran looked like a country on a fast track to becoming a modern regional power. He was not, by any reasonable definition, a constitutional monarch. Political parties were tightly controlled, then in the early 1970s consolidated into a single state-sanctioned party altogether. Dissent was policed by SAVAK, his intelligence service, an organization whose legacy remains one of the most disputed in modern Iranian history. Supporters of the monarchy have long argued SAVAK was a necessary instrument against communist infiltration and Islamist extremism in a genuinely dangerous Cold War neighborhood, one where a hostile Soviet Union sat directly on Iran's northern border. Critics, including much of the revolutionary movement that eventually toppled him, describe a machinery of surveillance, imprisonment, and torture used against liberal reformers as readily as against violent radicals. Both descriptions come from real historical actors with real stakes in how the story gets told, and neither can be waved away. What's not disputed is the scale of what the Shah had built by 1979, a state where enormous oil wealth sat next to widespread poverty, where a small elite lived in extraordinary luxury while religious and working-class Iranians felt increasingly shut out, and where the only organized force with the reach to challenge the monarchy, after the Shah had spent years jailing or exiling his secular and liberal opposition, turned out to be the country's Shiite clergy. That last detail matters more than almost anything else in this story. In eliminating his moderate critics, the Shah had cleared the field for the one opposition movement he couldn't co-opt or negotiate with, a religious movement led by a cleric in exile named Ruhollah Khomeini, broadcasting cassette-taped sermons back into Iran from Iraq and later France. By the end of 1978, strikes had paralyzed the country. Oil workers, bank employees, government ministries, all walking out at once. Protesters were being killed in the streets. The Shah's own government was, in the words of one contemporary Iranian diplomat, disintegrating in real time. Even his Western allies had quietly concluded, in private meetings at a summit in Guadeloupe in January 1979, that there was no saving him. One prime minister after another was appointed and failed to restore order. The last of them lasted barely a month. He had built an empire on oil, loyalty, and fear. In January 1979, all three ran out at once. That power was never built alone. The Shah's military buildup depended heavily on Washington. Decades of arms sales, training programs, and a close intelligence relationship that made Iran, for much of the Cold War, one of the United States' most valuable partners in a volatile region. That closeness cut both ways. It gave the Shah access to some of the most advanced weaponry outside NATO. It also meant that when the revolution came, one of the loudest charges leveled against him, by the clergy, by students, by ordinary Iranians who felt shut out of the oil boom, was that he had turned the country into an American client state, more accountable to Washington than to his own people. That charge, fair or not, would outlive the Shah himself by decades, feeding directly into the anger that met the U.S. decision to admit him for medical treatment the following year. The unraveling was faster than the usual image of a slow-motion collapse suggests. As recently as 1977, the Shah had been hosted at the White House by President Carter, who had a state dinner called Iran, an island of stability in a turbulent region. This line would be quoted back at both men for decades afterward, first as flattery, later as one of the more spectacularly wrong predictions in modern diplomatic history. Less than 2 years separated that toast from the airport departure. In between, a controversial newspaper article, widely read as an attack on Khomeini, which set off riots in the religious city of Qom in January 1978. A fire at a cinema in Abadan that August, which killed hundreds and was blamed by protesters on the Shah's security services, though responsibility was never conclusively established. And a massacre of demonstrators in Tehran's Jaleh Square that September, on a day that came to be remembered as Black Friday. Each event compounded the last. By December 1978, an estimated 2 million people marched through Tehran calling for the Shah's removal. In a country of roughly 36 million, a demonstration of a scale that made the government's position essentially unworkable. On the morning of January 16, 1979, the Shah and Empress Farah boarded a plane at Tehran's Mehrabad airport. He would later say he was leaving for a vacation and would return once the unrest had settled. Nobody who watched the footage believed that, including, by most accounts, the man himself. It was reported that he and Farah loaded a substantial portion of the family's wealth onto 2 planes bound for Aswan, in southern Egypt, a detail that would later feed years of dispute over exactly how much the family had taken with them, and to where. The headline that ran across Iran that day has been called the most famous in the country's history. 3 words, translated simply as, "The Shah is gone." Newspapers carrying it reportedly sold over 1 million copies within hours. In Tehran, crowds pulled down statues of the Shah and his father within the day. Here's the detail that gets lost in the historical shorthand. The Shah was already dying. He had been diagnosed with a form of lymphatic cancer years earlier, a fact his own government had kept hidden from the Iranian public, and, by most accounts, from Washington as well. The man boarding that plane was not simply a deposed monarch. He was a terminally ill deposed monarch with no fixed destination, no guaranteed asylum anywhere on earth, and a revolution behind him that wanted him back to stand trial. 14 days later, on February 1st, Khomeini returned to Tehran after 15 years of his own exile, greeted at the airport by crowds estimated in the millions. By April 1st, Iranians had voted in a national referendum to formally establish the Islamic Republic. The monarchy that had ruled Iran in one form or another for over 2,000 years no longer existed as a legal fact. The Shah, meanwhile, was airborne, with a fortune in tow and nowhere confirmed to land. What followed was less a graceful exile than a diplomatic scramble, country by country, each stop shorter and less certain than the last. He went first to Egypt, received by President Anwar Sadat, an old ally willing to take the political risk of hosting him. From there, Morocco, where King Hassan II gave him refuge but under mounting pressure not to let the stay drag on. Then the Bahamas, where officials reportedly grew uneasy about the diplomatic weight of hosting him and made clear the arrangement wouldn't be permanent. Then Mexico, the longest and most stable of the stops before the United States. At every stage, the pattern repeated. A head of state, one of the wealthiest men in the world at that point in modern history, effectively being passed between countries willing to shelter him for a while, but not indefinitely, and increasingly not without political cost to themselves. Picture the actual logistics of it. One of the wealthiest men on earth, a sitting, if deposed, head of state, being quietly told by one government after another that the welcome had an expiration date. That's not how exile is usually depicted. It's usually depicted as a kind of permanent, static condition, a man in a villa somewhere, waiting. This was closer to an itinerary, rewritten every few weeks, by governments calculating exactly how much international pressure they could absorb. And the entire time the man was dying. His cancer was progressing, and by several accounts his condition was deteriorating faster than his hosts, or even some of his own family, fully understood. The country best equipped to treat him, the United States, his most powerful longtime backer, the government that had helped keep him in power after a 1953 crisis that many Iranians never forgot, was also the country most exposed politically if it let him in. For months, Washington hesitated. The State Department had reasonable fears about what admitting the Shah might trigger inside Iran, where anger at American support for his regime was already running white-hot. Some officials argued for admitting him on humanitarian grounds regardless of the risk. Others warned it would be read inside Iran as proof that the United States intended to engineer his return to power, exactly as it had a quarter-century earlier. But by October 1979, with his condition worsening and few other options left, the Carter administration made the call: the Shah would be admitted to the United States for medical treatment. That decision was about to collide with a year of accumulated revolutionary anger, in a way almost nobody in Washington had fully priced in. The work of actually finding the Shah a landing spot fell not to the U.S. government but to three private citizens: David Rockefeller, chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State, and John J. McCloy, a veteran statesman with decades of ties to the Shah. Rockefeller's interest wasn't purely sentimental. His bank had syndicated well over $1 billion in loans for Iranian projects under the monarchy, money whose safety depended in part on the Shah's continued goodwill. The three men phoned Carter, wrote to his Secretary of State, and pressed the humanitarian case directly, for months, while career diplomats hedged. A sitting former head of state, one of the wealthiest men alive, needed private citizens to lobby his case to the U.S. government, because the normal machinery of diplomacy had quietly decided he was too dangerous a guest to be seen inviting in. Meanwhile, back in Tehran, the new Islamic Republic was formally demanding his extradition, and Iranian state media was broadcasting the Shah's travels as proof that the revolution's enemies were still being sheltered by the same Western powers who had propped him up for decades. Every country that took him in, even briefly, absorbed some version of that accusation. It is one reason the stays kept getting shorter. On October 22, 1979, the Shah arrived in New York for treatment of lymphatic cancer. Within 2 weeks, on November 4th, a crowd of Iranian students and militants stormed the American embassy in Tehran. Iranian police, by most accounts, stood by and did not intervene. The militants took more than 60 Americans hostage. Their central demand: hand the Shah back to Iran to face trial. It would be a mistake to say this decision alone caused the hostage crisis. The revolutionary anger that produced it had been building for months, fed by decades of resentment over American support for the monarchy, and by deep suspicion that history was about to repeat itself. Many Iranians remembered 1953, when a covert operation backed by the CIA had helped restore the Shah to power after he'd briefly lost it. The fear that Washington might again try to reinstall him was not paranoia. It was a lesson drawn from recent memory, one the revolutionary government invoked explicitly in justifying the embassy seizure. The embassy takeover sat at the convergence of all of it: medical admission, historical grievance, revolutionary momentum, not as a single trigger, but as the spark that met kindling that had been accumulating for a generation. 52 Americans would be held for 444 days. The crisis would define the final year of Jimmy Carter's presidency. In April 1980, Carter authorized a covert military operation to rescue the hostages by force. Helicopters and transport planes staged in the Iranian desert, aiming to slip into Tehran under cover of night. It failed before it reached the city. A sandstorm, mechanical failures, and a collision between a helicopter and a transport aircraft left 8 American servicemen dead and the mission abandoned on the sand, its wreckage broadcast on Iranian television as proof of American weakness. Many historians argue the failure, layered on top of a crisis that had already dragged on for months, contributed directly to Carter's loss of re-election that November. And the man at the center of the demand, the reason, ostensibly, all of it was happening, left the United States for Panama within weeks of the embassy seizure, once his immediate treatment was complete. His stay there grew politically and medically complicated enough that, by the following spring, he needed somewhere else to go. The hostages would not come home until January 1981, the day of Ronald Reagan's inauguration. By then, the man they were supposedly being held over was already gone. In March 1980, Anwar Sadat once again opened the door. The Shah returned to Egypt, this time for good. He underwent a splenectomy, the surgical removal of his spleen, as his cancer continued to spread, part of a last, failing effort to slow the disease. On the morning of July 27, 1980, at a military hospital in Cairo, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi died. He was 60 years old. The official cause was complications from infection following the splenectomy, the final entry in a 2-year medical decline that had shaped nearly every decision of his exile, from which countries he could enter to how long he could realistically expect to stay in any of them. Sadat gave him a state funeral on July 30th at Cairo's Al-Rifai Mosque, one of the only heads of state willing to do so publicly, at a moment when most governments preferred to keep their distance. The guest list itself told its own story about how far the family's standing had fallen. Members of the Pahlavi dynasty, a scattering of foreign delegations, ordinary Cairo residents who turned out to watch, but conspicuously few sitting heads of state, most of whom judged the political cost of attending too high. Sadat himself would be assassinated a little over a year later, driven above all by Islamist fury over his peace treaty with Israel. But his decision to let the Shah die on Egyptian soil rather than hand him back was, by multiple accounts, one more grievance stacked onto that list. Compare that funeral to what the man had commanded 18 months earlier, a military of 500,000, an oil economy generating tens of billions of dollars a year, absolute authority over a nation of more than 30 million people. He died in a hospital bed in a country that wasn't his, buried in a mosque that wasn't home, survived by a family that no longer had anywhere to call home either. The King of Kings was gone. What remained was the family he left behind, and the question of what exactly they had inherited. Empress Flora did not disappear. She became, in the decades that followed, the most visible custodian of the Pahlavi legacy, settling eventually in Greenwich, Connecticut, writing a memoir, giving interviews, appearing at international forums, keeping her late husband's version of Iranian history in public circulation. Of the family's original core, she has proven the most durable and remains, well into her 80s, the family's most consistent public voice. Ashraf Pahlavi, the Shah's twin sister, had been a genuinely influential political operator in her own right before the revolution, active in international diplomacy and reportedly involved in intelligence matters connected to the monarchy, and she continued advocating from exile for years afterward, though the specifics of her later influence are less documented than her brother's reign. She died in Monte Carlo in 2016, one of the last surviving figures who had known the Pahlavi court at the height of its power. Exile doesn't land on every child in a family the same way, and the 2 youngest Pahlavi children carried it differently than anyone else, differently enough that it broke them. Layla Pahlavi was 9 years old when the plane left Tehran. What followed was, by most accounts, a childhood and young adulthood spent trying to build a stable life out of guarded residences, unfamiliar schools, and a permanent sense of dislocation, an education at an Ivy League university, fluency in 3 languages, a life split between the United States and Paris. In June 2001, at the age of 31, she was found dead in a London hotel room. An inquest attributed her death to a barbiturate overdose and ruled a probable suicide. Her mother later said, in the years that followed, that Layla had struggled for a long time before her death. Her older brother, Ali Reza Pahlavi, was by every account close to her, and those close to the family have said he never fully recovered from her death. He had been the family's scholar, undergraduate music studies, then ancient Iranian studies at the graduate level, postgraduate research at one of the country's most prestigious universities, a quieter public presence than his older brother Reza. In January 2011, a decade after his sister's death, he took his own life at his home in Boston. He was 44. Family friends described a man who had carried the weight of exile and of his father's and sister's deaths for most of his adult life without ever fully setting it down. 2 children of a deposed monarchy, born into more privilege than almost anyone alive, dead by their own hand within a decade of each other. It's tempting to read that as simple tragedy and move on. Sit with it instead. Exile doesn't just cost a family its palaces and its power. For some of the people living through it, it costs them everything else too. There is also an older half-sister, Shahnaz Pahlavi, the Shah's daughter from his first marriage, who took a different path than any of her siblings. She largely withdrew from public life after the revolution, giving almost no interviews and making almost no political statements in the decades since. A quiet contrast to a family whose other surviving members have spent their exile in one form of public view or another. The wider Pahlavi family fared no better as a group than the Shah's own children did. Several of his relatives scattered across Europe and North America after 1979, and more than one met an ending that added to the family's reputation, fairly or not, as a dynasty pursued by bad luck. A niece of the Shah's, Ashraf's daughter, spent decades in Paris involved in opposition activities before her own death there in 2011. A half-brother of the Shah's was arrested in Beverly Hills in the early 1990s on drug-related charges and died within the same year as Layla, in 2001. No single thread here proves a pattern. Families this large lose members to ordinary misfortune too, but taken together, they help explain why the Pahlavi name, in diaspora circles, carries as much association with tragedy as with lost grandeur. Farah, for her part, never remarried. She has spent much of her later life dividing time between the United States and France, and has continued, even into her late 80s, to represent the family at state functions and cultural events tied to the Iranian diaspora. In interviews over the years, she has described the deaths of her two youngest children as the defining grief of her life. Heavier, she has said, than the loss of the throne itself. That leaves Reza Pahlavi, the eldest son, and the one who chose, from the moment his father died, to keep the family's political claim alive. Before he was a political figure, he was a teenager, on the other side of the world from his family, when everything collapsed. Reza Pahlavi had been sent to Reese Air Force Base in Lubbock, Texas, in the summer of 1978, on his father's orders, for a year-long jet fighter pilot training program, and he was still mid-course when the monarchy he was supposed to inherit ceased to exist. 17 years old, learning of his own exile the way much of the rest of the world did, he finished the flight training anyway. Then came a political science degree from the University of Southern California, completed in 1985, folded in around a life spent rejoining a family with nowhere permanent to live. Then, on his 20th birthday, a self-declaration, at a ceremony in a Cairo palace, months after his father's death, he proclaimed himself Shah of Iran. What followed was 4 decades of refusing to let the story end. He co-founded opposition coalitions, the Iran National Council among them, in the 2010s, courted Western governments, and positioned himself, more or less continuously, as the man Iran might turn to if the Islamic Republic ever fell. For long stretches, the effort produced more defections and infighting among Iran's fractured opposition than actual momentum. To most observers, his role read as a long shot kept alive mainly by an aging diaspora. That changed dramatically, and recently, the ground had already been shifting before the strikes came. In late December 2025, widespread economic hardship and the collapse of Iran's national currency sparked massive anti-government protests across the country. The regime responded by imposing a nationwide internet blackout, cutting off most of the outside world's view of what was happening inside. Estimates that later emerged suggested the crackdown killed over 6,000 protesters, with thousands more deaths still under investigation. That was the backdrop, a country already in open revolt against its own government over its economy, when the airstrikes arrived 2 months later. In late February 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated air and missile strikes on Iran, aiming by their own stated goal to force regime change and cripple Iran's nuclear and missile programs. Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the opening strikes. The Islamic Republic did not fall. What followed instead was months of escalation across the region, Iranian missile and drone strikes on American bases and on Israel, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz to global shipping, fighting that spread into Lebanon between Israel and Iran-backed Hezbollah. Ceasefires were negotiated, first a 2-week pause in April brokered by Pakistan, later a formal memorandum of understanding signed in June, which included provisions for a large private investment fund intended to help stabilize Iran's economy in exchange for a permanent halt to hostilities. Iran's government, for its part, has laid out its own conditions for any lasting peace, binding guarantees against future attacks, formal recognition of what it calls its legitimate rights, and reparations for the damage already done. Those conditions have not been met, and the ceasefire has kept collapsing. As of this month, the truce brokered over the summer is fraying again, with strikes resuming around the Strait of Hormuz after Iranian attacks on commercial vessels, and both sides trading accusations of violation. Reza Pahlavi's answer to that moment had been rehearsed for 46 years. He was ready to give it. He has met with American officials and voiced confidence in the Trump administration's willingness to back Iran's opposition. He has addressed a major U.S. political conference to a standing ovation, telling the crowd, "President Trump is making America great again. I intend to make Iran great again." He has spoken at the Munich Security Conference, calling for tighter sanctions, potential further military pressure, and a rapid political transition, arguing that hesitation would cost more lives than action. He has been discussed by name in serious foreign policy circles as a possible transitional figure should the Islamic Republic collapse. Some in the Iranian diaspora and inside Iran itself have rallied to him, others haven't. Political prisoners and longtime activists have accused him of aligning himself with foreign military strikes on his own country and of never fully reckoning with his father's authoritarian record. Reporting has also surfaced an influence campaign, funded by Israeli entities, promoting him to Persian-speaking audiences online, a detail that has only deepened suspicion among his critics about how organic his renewed prominence really is. Nothing in that record resolves the underlying question the man has spent 46 years trying to answer on his family's behalf, whether a monarchy that ended by popular revolution can, or should, come back at all. That question remains exactly as contested today, in the middle of a live and currently re-escalating war, as it has ever been. What's not contested is this: Iran's monarchy has no legal mechanism for restoration. It ended in a referendum in April 1979 and has not existed since. Everything Reza Pahlavi has built in the decades since is built on top of that fact, not around it. Start where we started. A man in Washington, in Stockholm, in a convention hall in Texas, still introducing himself, in effect, as a king. Not because the throne is his, legally it isn't, and hasn't been since before most of his current supporters were born, but because the story his family represents never fully closed. That's the part the tidy version of history leaves out. Empires don't end on the day the ruler leaves the palace. They end, if they end at all, somewhere much messier and much later. In a hospital room in a borrowed country, in a hotel room in London, in a house in Boston, in a war that's still going on this week, decades after the crown itself stopped meaning anything legally binding. Most fallen dynasties get to fade quietly into ceremony. This one didn't get that option, because the country it lost never stopped being contested, and neither, as a result, has it. The Pahlavis lost Iran in 18 months, from an airport departure to a funeral in Cairo. They have spent the 46 years since finding out what a family does with a claim to a country that no longer wants a king, some of them by trying to move on, some by trying to keep the door open, and some who never survived the weight of it at all. Whether that door ever actually opens again isn't a question history has answered yet. It's one Iran itself is still fighting over, right now, in real time,